Christianity isn't a Western religion, despite what some people say. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that it's not for people in the West also, but I mean it didn't start in the West. As some people say, it's just for white people, or some people say it's just for Westerners. Those categories are not the same thing, but they overlap sometimes. Well, historically, white people and Westerners are included, but their dominance was only during a particular era, actually not this current era, and it wasn't that way from the beginning, and it wasn't that way through much of history. If we go back to Christianity as it was authored by Jesus, well, he was preaching to his fellow Jewish people, and his followers very quickly learned that this message could also spread among Gentiles, among non-Jewish people. Look at Matthew's gospel. Look at Acts. Look at Romans. Look at Galatians. Look at Ephesians. Look at Revelation. Now, I could go into each of those in great detail, but I've done that in other videos. So let me stay closer to the point here. Geographically, Christianity started in Asia. It's an Asian religion. It started on the cusp of Africa, pretty close to Africa, closer to Africa, actually, than to Europe. The Americas, where I'm from, don't appear in Scripture, except in the summaries. Every people and nation, well, we are in the summaries, so we're good. Some people say that Christianity spread only violently through colonialism. That's actually not true. It was sometimes true, as with Catholic conquistadors in much of Latin America, and maybe following some models of earlier Islamic conquest and colonialism, like with the Byzantine Empire. But this violated the dominant model of mission that depended on persuasion. It certainly violated the teaching of Jesus and his first followers, who actually, by the way, were pacifists for the first few centuries of the Roman Empire. Whatever you think of pacifism, at least you can say it doesn't spread itself violently, which, again, wouldn't fit the early model of Christianity. And it was far from the usual model historically. Most mission fields were opened not through conquest, but through martyrdom, including in Rome and the Roman Empire, and later in Northern Europe as well. Now, it didn't spread through martyrdom everywhere. So in East Africa, in the 4th century, they received the gospel peacefully from Syrian Christians. That is, again, from Asia, not from Europe. And again, I'm not trying to be down on Europe or my continent, but yeah, it just talking about in general historically. In terms of indigenous church principles, that is, communicating the gospel in culturally intelligible forms, so you don't have to like adopt somebody else's culture to become a follower of Jesus. Paul's idea was, yes, Gentiles can stay Gentiles so long as they follow Jesus and what it means to follow Jesus, including following the scriptures that God had already given and the principles there in terms of morality and so forth. Paul's rivals in Galatia said that doesn't go far enough. They said, no, you have to accept our culture and more elements of our culture to be followers of Jesus. So there were two models of mission already vying for attention in the 1st century. Paul's model of mission won out in at least most of the ancient world. And those of you who are male can be grateful for that, and that we don't have to get circumcised when we become followers of Jesus, although many of us in the West are circumcised anyway, which makes it a whole lot easier not having to worry about the issue. But through history, there were many who followed this model of not imposing your own culture on other people, but saying, okay, the gospel is for all cultures, and it can be expressed in local cultural forms. Jesuits understood this in China, in Korea, The church spread especially that way. Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission almost went native, to use certain missiological language. Missionaries were often at odds with colonial authorities. William Carey was opposed by the British East India Company that was exploiting India. The British ruled northern Nigeria through the House of Fulani and actually forbade missionaries from working there because they didn't want to disturb the House of Fulani Islamic way of doing things. So the middle belt of Nigeria, which actually wasn't under Islam, was actually placed under Islam by the British. Catholics, although missionaries did go there and spread the gospel, despite the intentions of certain authorities. Catholics were excluded in British-ruled countries, Protestants in French-ruled countries, not totally excluded, but I mean in terms of their missionaries weren't always welcome there, had a much rougher time there. In Manipur in India, in the north, it was a rogue missionary, despite colonial resistance. So in a lot of places, the missionaries were at odds with colonial authorities and actually had to defend local people, including during King Leopold's Belgium, King Leopold's Belgian rule of what was called the Belgian Congo, later called Zaire, now called Democratic Republic of Congo, exploiting people. It was missionaries who sent word to the outside world, especially some African American missionaries, got word out to the outside world and said, "This is what's happening. Here are the pictures of what's happening," and helped spearhead the protest against King Leopold's basically treating the Belgian Congo as his own personal slave colony. Glenn Usry and I addressed some of these issues roughly 30 years ago in Black Man's Religion, especially focusing on the history of African Christianity. And many other people have done it too. I just bring this up to say, I'm not just talking about this now, I've been talking about it for a while. That's a picture of me back when I had hair. And it's also illustrated by my wife, Medine's, and my respective backgrounds. Medine grew up in a Christian home in the Republic of Congo, not to be confused with the Democratic Republic of Congo. They're adjacent countries. My wife is from the smaller one. But she grew up in a Christian home. Her parents were first-generation Christians. They'd been converted from polytheistic backgrounds. I grew up in an unchurched household in the West. I was an atheist and converted from that background. So our own backgrounds don't match with the narrative that you hear sometimes in some circles that Christianity is a Western religion. Now, it was always God's plan to work among all peoples. So as early as Abraham in Genesis 12:3, you have a table of the nations, you have the scattering of the languages in chapters 10 and 11. You get to chapter 12. In you, Abram, all the families of the earth will be blessed. That was God's purpose from the beginning. And not to trace it through all of Scripture, but just to say in Isaiah 19, he speaks of Egypt and Assyria becoming his people alongside of Israel. In Zechariah 2, he speaks of many nations joining themselves to the Lord in that day and becoming his people. Now, the idea, of course, was that they would be accepting the God of Israel. So it's not like instead of Israel, but certainly alongside of Israel, God was bringing together people from every people and nation. That includes in my continent. So, but the continents we have culturally are kind of arbitrary. They were defined by the Greeks, but they're still in use today. So we may as well talk in those terms for a little while. Greeks defined Europe as themselves and everything to the north and west, which they hadn't really explored a whole lot at that point. They had a lot more interaction with Asia to the east. And most of the Bible actually takes place in Asia. and in Africa. So in Asia, Central and Western Asia, especially in, the Holy Land, and Africa, especially in Egypt. Everything to the south of Greece was considered Africa. Now, interestingly, the first Gentile Christian was from Africa, south of Egypt. So it starts in Asia. First Gentile convert is from Africa. Jesus called his followers to be witnesses to the ends of the earth, Acts 1:8. Well, what does he mean by the ends of the earth? What were the ends of the earth that they knew of back then? Well, to the west, people in the Roman Empire thought of Spain, which was part of the Roman Empire by that point, and the river Ocean. They thought it was a river, but very big river. And to the east, they knew of Parthia, India, China. They got most of their silk from China, a lot of other trade from India. Actually, there were trading ships that went in the 2nd century as far as Vietnam, and some of the Roman traders were escorted then to the court of the Emperor of China, who was at that time also in charge of Vietnam. To the east, they knew of places like that. To the north, they knew of Scythia, which would overlap probably with Iran and Russia. They knew of Germany. The Roman Empire had a lot of battles with Germans. And Britain, they actually had conquered part of, well, they actually, not at the time that Jesus would have said this, but during the 1st century. And by the time the book of Acts was written, I believe, they had already conquered part of Britain. To the south, they knew of Africa south of Egypt. They had trade ties as far south as Tanzania. There's been a bust of Caesar found there. And they knew of the Nubian kingdom of Meroe, which was south of Egypt. And I'll talk about that more in a few moments. Most people in the Roman Empire didn't have any idea of the Americas, but again, we're included. The mission in the book of Acts is open-ended. It continues today because the ends of the earth that they knew of, well, go far beyond the end of the book of Acts. In Acts 8:26-40, we have the conversion to Christianity of an African official. He's the first fully Gentile convert. Now you have proselytes and God-fearers before this. You'll have another God-fearer after this. But you have a God-fearer after this in Acts chapter 10. You have a proselyte from Antioch in Acts chapter 6. That is a Gentile converted to Judaism. But here you have a fully Gentile convert, even though he's more committed to Jewish faith than is Cornelius in Acts chapter 10. He's not able to fully convert to Judaism because he's a eunuch. That's mentioned 5 times here. Some people say, it's figurative. But sometimes you could use the word eunuch figuratively, but that was far from the most common use in antiquity. And the fact that Luke emphasizes it 5 times, I mean, he only mentions he's the treasurer of the queen once, even though that's a great title, but he mentions he's a eunuch 5 times. Male servants of queens were often eunuchs, and that means that he can't be a proselyte. He couldn't convert fully to Judaism. So here we have the first fully Gentile Christian, and he's from Africa. And everybody knew that people from Ethiopia, that's the Greek term that's used here. We translated Ethiopia, but it's bigger than Ethiopia. It was the Greek term for all of Africa south of Egypt. And it was considered a clearly black kingdom. Now, sometimes the Greeks called Egyptians black because they were blacker than Greeks were, but they really considered definitely people from Ethiopia to be black. And this particular person, this is not a head, by the way, this is a figure of a head. So nobody was decapitated to make this picture. But it's clearly people knew a lot about the kingdom of Meroe at this time. And this is clearly the kingdom of Meroe because the Queen Mother's title is the Kendaka there. So it was a Nubian empire that existed since about 750 BC. The empire was in decline in this period, but it still was pretty strong. I mean, Rome had tried to conquer it when they conquered Egypt, but the kingdom of Meroe would not let them do that. They resisted, and Rome had to make an alliance, a treaty with them. There was actually a Roman expedition in Nero's time, and they came back and reported on some of the things there. Rome had trade ties with the kingdom of Meroe, by which they obtained materials from further south in the interior of Africa. And, Meroe became fairly wealthy because of the trade between the north and the south. This region, the Nubian region, was fully converted in the 5th to the 6th centuries and remained a Christian kingdom for 1,000 years until it was forcibly subjected to Islam, and the priests were slaughtered on the altars, and the churches were turned into mosques. But it was a completely Christian kingdom in Africa for 1,000 years. Now, Augustus claims to have defeated the Kendaka in battle, the Queen Mother of Meroe in battle, but his concessions suggest that she really beat him pretty badly. Archaeologists rediscovered the site in 1722. It was identified as such in 1909 to 1914, and some expeditions have continued since then. The Kendaka was used by Greeks as the title of the ruling Queen Mother. Africans probably used the title more widely. And one of them in this period, possibly the queen at this point, is Queen Nawedemak. And Nubian art and also archaeology, as you see here, illustrates the queen's jewels and her often wide girth, which were meant to emphasize her wealth, her prosperity. Here we have in this picture the Meroitic queen's shoulder collar. Well, if she was wealthy, you can imagine that her treasurer was a very powerful person. It was a wealthy kingdom, and he also would know Greek. That's why he could communicate with Philip, even though Meroe had its own language. But, Greek was used in trade ties with Egypt, and so this treasurer spoke Greek and could communicate with Philip. Here's a picture on the wall from Meroe, where it's been excavated, of Amanatora, who was also a queen in the 1st century. Some have argued that she was the Kendaka of this period, though some others, as I said, and myself tending this way, favor Nawedemak. And here we have another shoulder collar that was used for a queen from like a century earlier. Meroe's famous wealth is attested archaeologically. It was ideally positioned for trade, so it's no surprise that the official that Philip meets has his own carriage. Now, there were novels that talked about Ethiopia and so on. They don't get the facts straight, usually. They don't care that much about the facts. But what we have in Acts 8 actually does match what we know of Meroe, and leads us to believe, yes, this is a real historical event where this first convert to Christianity was from Africa. And we already mentioned that they spoke Greek. The Isaiah scroll, the reason Philip can understand it, presumably it's a Greek translation that the African court official may have picked up in Alexandria, or may have picked it up in Jerusalem. They also had Greek scrolls available. Also, the gospel reached Europe from Asia. Paul's voyage from Troas to Macedonia may have communicated more to ancient audiences than we think of today. Troas was a very significant port. And as you see, Paul and Silas, they sailed from Troas. Next day, they reached Samothrace, which was roughly in between Troas and Macedonia. And then they sailed on to Neapolis. And from there, they could voyage inland to Philippi, which was an important city in Macedonia. It was a Roman colony there, just like Troas was a Roman colony in Asia Minor. When people in the Roman Empire thought of Troas, they thought of the Trojan War. Now, Alexandria, Troas was a Roman colony. It was actually near the old city of Troy. It wasn't exactly the old city of Troy, but the whole area was called the Troad, and it was associated with the Trojan War. I didn't want to get sued for using other people's pictures on the internet, so here are some of my boyhood pictures back before I was a Christian. I'm not so violent now, but pretending to be a Trojan. Actually, I was pretending to be a Greek hero fighting Trojans. Yep, I definitely was very one-sided back then. I liked the Greeks more, and now I realize it's really sad that both sides were fighting each other. But anyway, the Trojan War, in Greek literature, the Trojan War was considered a European invasion of Asia. And the Iliad, which is about part of year 10 of the Trojan War, the Iliad was the most widely read and widely listened to book in the Greek-speaking world. The Romans actually traced their ancestry back to Troy, so they favored the other side. I used to be Greek biased versus Rome biased. Now I try to just love everybody. But anyway, getting back to the point, the Trojan War in this period was viewed as a European invasion of Asia. Now, for that reason, Alexander the Great, who grew up hearing the Iliad, he was from Macedonia, considering himself culturally Greek, he claimed that his invasion of Persia was a further European invasion of Asia. And he conquered the Persian Empire, but he started at Troy because he wanted to emulate the Trojan War. So this was all present in the minds of people in the Roman Empire. Alexandria, Troas was a pretty big city at this point, not a mega city by today's standards, but by standards of the Roman Empire, it was pretty big. Rome may have had 1 million people, but if you had 100,000 people, that was pretty big in the Roman Empire. Alexandria, Troas had maybe 100,000 people. It was a Roman colony. It was near Old Troy. But now we have, instead of a European invasion of Asia, we have Asians coming to Europe with the good news of peace, the good news of Jesus Christ. Not a military invasion, but something that would transform Europe eventually. The Roman Empire actually was not, we think of it as a European empire because of the legacy inherited by Europe in the long run. Well, maybe not entirely just today, but through a lot of history. But it actually was an empire at this point that included part of Western Asia and a lot of Western Asia and North Africa and Southern Europe and just parts of the North, like parts of Britain. So even the Roman Empire becoming predominantly Christian was not just a European thing. It stayed in Europe longer, whereas some other parts were conquered. Although even after parts were conquered, what was Asia Minor and Syria and Egypt were predominantly Christian for probably another 1,000 years until the numbers kind of dwindled in some of those regions. The dominant Christian regions in the 2nd and 3rd centuries were especially Syria, Turkey, and North Africa. So you see it's shifted over time. And as Turkey fell politically. Christianity was spreading in Russia and some other places, Ukraine, what we now call Ukraine in Russia. In North Africa, Tertullian, late 2nd, early 3rd century, Tertullian, a North African church father, protests to the emperor, why do you mistrust us Christians? If we wanted to take over the empire, we would do it. We already outnumber your legions. But look, that's not our objective. We just want to help people. Many of the church's leading theologians, sorry for the typo there, many of the church's leading theologians came from Africa. Tertullian, who coined the term Trinity, was from North Africa, Western North Africa. Athanasius in Egypt was a leading defender of the Trinity. He was labeled by his enemies the Black Dwarf, which suggests that they understood he was black, and he also was probably fairly short. Augustine, who was the largest influence on subsequent Western Christianity theologically, was also from North Africa. And we don't know exactly the ethnicity of his father, where his father's ancestors were from, but his mother, Monica, was probably a Berber, and she was the one who had the biggest she was the one who had the theological and spiritual influence on him. His father was not a Christian. In terms of where Christianity spread in Asia, Armenia became the first Christian kingdom, converted around the year 301. It was the traditional buffer between the Roman and Parthian empires. Axum, which was in East Africa, and today we speak of, today what was Axum is part of the nation of Ethiopia. Axum was converted around 333 through the witness of Syrian Christians. So again, through the witness of Christians from Asia. And all this is well documented. I mean, it's not just Western sources that report this, although Western sources have tended to talk more about, the West, because that's where the West's immediate heritage was from. But it's in Western sources. It's also in Ethiopian sources. It's attested archaeologically. It's attested in Syrian sources, and so forth. It's really well attested that Axum was converted in the year 333, before the Roman Empire became officially Christian, after they started tolerating and not persecuting Christians, but before the Roman Empire became Christian, part of East Africa became Christian, and also a kingdom in Asia had become Christian. Again, much archaeological evidence. As far as India, the tradition is that the Apostle Thomas preached in India in the year 52. I say the tradition because, we don't have all the evidence at our disposal, but certainly Christianity reached India very early. The Mar Thoma Church, a Syrian Orthodox church, was established in India at the latest by the year 345. So again, close to the time when you have these other kingdoms converting to Christianity, Christianity is being established in India, again through Syrian missionaries, people from Asia, not from Europe. How long does it take for something to become an indigenous religion? Christianity goes way, way back in India, well before actually the evangelization of England, certainly before Augustine of Canterbury was appointed as Archbishop there. Nestorian missionaries soon took the gospel, and again, Nestorian missionaries, probably especially from Syria, took the gospel as far east as China in the 7th century, and we have concrete evidence of that. There may have been people who went before then. There were traders going along what became the silk trade route well before this. Way, way before this. So probably there were people who heard the gospel and spread the gospel before that. But we have concrete evidence of it from the 7th century forward. Jesuits came and ministered in China. and elsewhere in East Asia, Christianity adopting indigenous forms until some rivals back in Italy complained and reined in the Jesuits. This has happened sometimes where people back home told the missionaries, no, you have to make them more like us. But many of the missionaries who came to these other cultures adopted a lot of aspects of the culture to which they were ministering themselves, learning from the local culture. Again, I mentioned earlier Hudson Taylor and the China Inland Mission. And also in Korea, that was true in terms of the indigenous church principles. In China, indigenous leaders in the early 20th century included people like John Sun, who was a major Chinese evangelist with signs and wonders, healed blindness, inability to walk, and so on. He ministered elsewhere in Asia as well, in Indonesia and so forth. A big emphasis on the indigenous church, opposed dependence on foreign missionaries, said, we can evangelize our own culture even better than you guys from outside can do it. Christianity in China was there long before atheism. And it's, after all, an indigenous Asian religion from the start. Atheism, by contrast, was a Western import. You look at the early 20th century revivals to which many churches today around the world look back. You'd not only have the Welsh revival in 1904 to 1905, and the Azusa Street revival led by an African-American leader, 1906 to 1908, but also you have a major revival in India, and you have revivals in India and Indonesia in the 1800s too, but at Pandita Ramabai's orphanage in the Mukti mission, where there were reportedly tongues of fire appearing above the heads of the girls there, and they were having visions and so forth. So really significant things happening in various parts of the world. Also early, in that early period, the Methodist Church in Chile and Latin America. There were lots of things happening in many different parts of the world. I didn't want to, if I give too many examples, then the more examples I give, the more it's clear I'm leaving some people out. So we'll just stop with those. But and with the major Korean revival of 1907, which actually convinced some of the Western missionaries of continuing miracles, because they said, no, we don't think these things happen anymore. That's the way they taught us in seminary. And then with this revival happening, so many people were being healed and delivered. And the missionaries said, well, we'll do a study of this. They did a study and they found out, oh, the Korean Christians are right. And they learned from the Korean Christians there. You had West African prophets in the early 20th century who were opposed by Western colonialists. Now, not all of us would agree with all of their theology, but not all of us agree with all of each other's theology either, including some of the different church groups I've mentioned so far. But Prophet Garrick Sakari Braid healed the sick and caused rain to fall in the name of Israel's God, until the colonial authorities arrested him in 1916 for cutting into their liquor profits in West Africa. William Wade Harris, he's one of my favorites, had a healing ministry bringing tens of thousands to Christ in Cote d'Ivoire, Liberia, and Ghana. But he was barred from re-entry to Cote d'Ivoire, where he had a major, major impact. He was barred from re-entry there by the colonialists. He tried a few times to come back, and they wouldn't let him. Simon Kimbangu, he was a Baptist with an incredible healing ministry and was having a major impact for the gospel until Belgian authorities imprisoned him in 1921. And then his movement, if you've heard bad things about Kimbanguism, well, his movement kind of degenerated theologically, or at least most parts of the movement degenerated theologically when they were bereft of their leader. That was the fault of the colonial authorities. Colonial authorities often hampered indigenous church and mission. But once African churches gained more independence, the gospel exploded across Africa. That's when it really multiplied, along with the independence movements. when it was unhindered by colonial ties and some bad Western teachings, such as miracles don't happen anymore. This picture is actually from before then. Bishop Samuel Crowther was an Anglican bishop, but yeah, it was still during a time when a lot of things were being hampered by colonialism. But he was a major voice for African Christianity even before then. Now, this spread in my wife's country too. My wife's country was about 2% Christian in the year 1900. It's about 80% Christian now. And when I say Christian, I mean that generically. People who would call themselves that. We all know that not everybody lives by Jesus' teachings who uses the name Christian. That's true in the West. It's true everywhere else as well. Well, actually, in places where Christians get persecuted, usually you have to be pretty serious to stay a Christian. That was true often in the early church, and it's often true in many parts of the world today too. But anyway, my wife talks about one of the revival leaders in her country, Daniel Ndundu, in Congo Brazzaville, where she's from. The 1921 revival through Simon Kimbangu carried into the 1947 revival in Congo Brazzaville, my wife's country, through the link of Daniel Ndundu. And my wife's family actually knew him and were ministered to by him. And she can tell you about some of the miracles, and especially some of the prophecies that were given very accurately. And she's the one who actually wrote the article about him for the Dictionary of African Christian Biography online, both in English and French. She wrote it. Miracles happened during the Indonesian revivals in the 1860s, the Nias revival of 1916 to 1922, predominantly Lutherans there. The Nias church grew from 500 to 135,000 over the course of 40 years. And the West Timor revival, especially from 1965 to 1969. And a friend of mine, Mel Tari, actually, we weren't friends back when he wrote the book. I think I was like 12 years old, something like that. But major revival took place there in West Timor in Indonesia. And there have been a number of others. Christianity is the most global religion of any religion, and it's been that way for a long time. It's a global movement, certainly today, whereas fewer than 18% of Christians in 1900 lived outside Europe and North America. Those are the statistics I have. I think that they may not be taking into account Latin America. But anyway, whereas fewer than 18% of Christians in 1900, according to the stats I have, lived outside Europe and North America. Today, closer to 70% do. So the West, if we define it as Europe and North America and Australia and New Zealand, maybe, the West constitutes a minority of Christianity today. And in the 20th century, that shift took place among Anglicans, it took place among Catholics, it's taken place among a lot of Christian movements. Certainly Pentecostal and charismatic Christianity reportedly grew 6 times over in the 3 decades from 1970 to the year 2000, and has continued to grow, of course, since then. For evangelicals as a whole that overlap with a lot of these groups, 80% of evangelicals today live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So if you've been fed the thing, hey, evangelicals all belong to a certain political agenda, and that's all evangelicals are about, which is something that's often touted about in certain media circles in North America and sometimes in Europe. Most evangelicals don't live in North America or in Europe. And again, what has been said is often just about white evangelicals in North America, and actually white evangelicals in the US And again, not all white evangelicals in the US, but, most evangelicals in the world don't have anything to do with the things people try to associate them with. So, and again, I'm not saying everything that they get associated with is bad, but just saying don't stereotype all evangelicals the same way, because they're not all the same. Culturally, politically, politically, most of them have nothing to do with North American politics or whatever. Now, as to whether Scripture teaches the equality of all peoples made in God's image, the importance of ethnic reconciliation and unity and justice for all people, well, we could go on and talk about that, but again, I've done that in other videos. The point of this one was just to say, Christianity is not a Western religion, except in the sense that it's a religion for all people. Geographically, it started as an Asian faith, and next place it went was Africa. Then it went to Europe from Asia. And ultimately, the claim of Christianity is not that Christianity comes from just any one place. It comes from heaven. It comes from God. It's for all peoples. But if you're going to associate it with somewhere, it starts in Western Asia, among the Jewish people, and spread out from there.